What if I told you some spirits never left their graves, and tonight they might be watching you? If you love ghost stories, hit subscribe, tap like, and share this video so we can bring you even more terrifying tales. Subscribe, like, share to keep the ghosts coming.
The Everglades is not a place where silence is empty. Its silence is a living thing, breathing, shifting, whispering with the wings of unseen birds and the slow, endless sigh of water. To those who have walked its swamp paths or flown above its green, endless expanse, the Everglades is a cathedral of ghosts even before human tragedy stains it. Here shadows move where no human passes. Here the trees lean like ancient mourners. Here the air feels thick with unfinished sentences. The swamp does not simply absorb the dead, it keeps them. It remakes them into part of its eternal murmur. So when Eastern Airlines Flight 401 came hurtling into this wilderness in the final days of 1972, it was not merely a crash of machine and bone against earth and water. It was a joining, a fusing of the mechanical and the spiritual, of metal and spirit, of duty and death. To the outside world, the crash was tragedy, another page in the ledger of aviation accidents. But to those who lived in its shadow, and to those who later flew the same machine salvaged from its wreckage, it became something else. A haunting. The DC-10 was new then, a technological giant, a bird of ambition. It represented modernity, safety, the sleek face of an age convinced that humanity had mastered the skies. And perhaps that arrogance was part of the curse, for the skies rarely tolerate hubris. The machine bore within it not only passengers and crew, but also the fragile human assumption that death could be postponed indefinitely by rivets, circuits, and glowing green instrument panels. But the Everglades, older than industry, older than empire, would remind everyone otherwise. It was December 29th, a Thursday. The world was halfway between Christmas and New Year, a suspended season where airports thrummed with weary travelers, where cabins filled with people heading home, people escaping, people beginning anew. Eastern Airlines Flight 401 carried 176 souls from New York to Miami, the sort of flight so ordinary it could have disappeared into memory without a trace. And yet fate does not need grandeur to weave its tragedies. Sometimes the most banal details, a burnt-out bulb, a distracted moment, a silence mistaken for safety, can summon catastrophe. Captain Robert Alban Loft was a man shaped by the sky. 55 years old, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, he had spent much of his life translating wind and cloud into courses. He had lived through storms, through malfunctions, through countless nights at 30,000 feet, when the earth below became nothing more than a dark smear. His authority in the cockpit was unquestioned. Alongside him, First Officer Albert Stockstill, younger, steady, trained into calm precision. And behind them, monitoring the vital organs of the aircraft, Flight Engineer Donald Repo, a man known for his meticulousness, for the quiet dedication he carried like a sacrament. 3 men of competence. 3 men whose fates would be written into the mythology of aviation forever. The flight began as all flights do. Boarding, announcements, the shuffling of coats, the muted cough of engines stirring to life. Passengers settled into their seats, unaware that history was tightening its grip around them. Some would survive to tell their stories. Most would not. And those who died, well, their voices would continue, though not in ways science could explain. Take a moment to picture the cabin as it was then. No sleek plastic minimalism, but the padded chairs and heavy curtains of 1970s air travel. People lighting cigarettes, stewardesses in crisp uniforms offering coffee with rehearsed smiles. The soft hum of engines beneath conversation. To step into such a plane was to enter a floating hotel corridor, an artificial world where safety was assumed, where the very absurdity of being suspended above clouds was disguised by routine. For those passengers, December 29th was not meant to be the last entry in their lives' journals. It was simply a Thursday night. The climb from JFK was smooth. Altitude was achieved. Dinner trays collected. The night stretched long and uneventful. Even the crew, hardened by countless flights, expected nothing but another landing, another checklist, another disembarkation where the only notable detail would be the exhaustion of the holiday season. But destiny is cruel in its banality. It did not take an engine flameout, nor a violent storm, nor terrorism to undo Flight 401. It took a single light bulb. The nose landing gear indicator failed to illuminate, nothing more. A $20 component refusing to glow. Was the gear down or not? They could not be certain. The captain ordered the plane into a holding pattern above the black sprawl of the Everglades, buying time to check. A minor inconvenience, a delay, but it became an obsession. What followed in the cockpit is known in chilling detail. Men focused so intently on a minor technical issue that they did not notice the autopilot disengage. While Loft, Stockstill, and Repo debated the bulb, the plane slowly began to descend. The black swamp below gave no warning. No lights, no silhouettes, only an endless reflection of the starlit sky above. There was no horizon, no point of reference, only illusion. By the time anyone noticed the creeping altitude loss, it was too late. At 11:42 p.m., the DC-10 slammed into the swamp. The impact was apocalyptic. The fuselage ripped apart, flinging passengers and crew alike into mud, into water, into darkness that swallowed cries as fast as they were made. Some were killed instantly. Others survived only to drown, pinned beneath wreckage, their voices silenced under the heavy hands of water and grass. And amid it all, the swamp listened. Helicopters arrived, their spotlights cutting through the night, blades scattering the still air into frantic noise. Rescuers found survivors clinging to wreckage, faces pale, eyes wide with shock. They also found the dead, twisted into impossible angles, submerged, broken. The swamp had no mercy, no distinction between flesh and machine. Everything was equal to it. Captain Loft's body was recovered. Donald Repo lived a while longer, his body broken, but he too would soon surrender. Stockstill's life ended there as well. The men of the cockpit were gone, or so it seemed, because this is where the story ceases to be mere tragedy and becomes something far stranger, far more enduring. In the months that followed, Eastern Airlines made a decision that would inadvertently birth legend. The DC-10 was expensive, and much of its wreckage was salvageable. Components still intact, engines, galleys, electronics were carefully removed from the Everglades, scrubbed of mud, tested, and then reinstalled into other aircraft in the fleet. To the corporate mind, this was efficiency. To the world of folklore, it was transference. For those who would later fly on these planes, whispers began to spread, whispers of presences, of figures seen where none should be, of voices in the dark. The story of the DC-10 ghost is not simply about a crash. It is about what happens when tragedy refuses to stay in its grave, when men defined by duty cannot release the machines that bound them, when the Everglades gives up its dead but not their silence. And so, to understand the hauntings that would follow, the spectral appearances of Captain Loft and Donald Repo, the warnings given by disembodied voices, the apparitions glimpsed in ovens and cockpits, we must walk slowly back through the Everglades, through the wreckage, through the fog of memory. We must let the swamp speak, because the swamp never forgot. The swamp never forgets, and neither did the dead. The crash site was cleared, but the Everglades was never cleansed. Machines can be removed, metal can be melted down, reports can be archived, deaths tallied, news articles filed away into the neat coffins of libraries. But grief has no such obedience, nor does spirit. And so, the tragedy of Eastern Airlines Flight 401 did not end with funerals. It mutated, deepened, traveled along unexpected corridors of human imagination and mechanical reuse. For it was not long before whispers began to surface. At first, they were quiet, private confessions among crew members, remarks muttered over coffee in the sterile lounges of airports, admitted with embarrassed glances as though superstition was shameful. But shame does not erase experience. Shame cannot unsee what the eyes have burned into the mind. And soon, the story spread. It began with flight engineers. The DC-10 was still new to many, its systems complex, its demands precise. In the months after the crash, certain crews began to notice a strange figure lingering near the panels, the gauges, the labyrinth of switches. He wore the uniform of Eastern Airlines. His face was tired, his expression grave, his hands moving as though checking instruments. But when approached, he vanished. Again and again, the description was the same: mustached, solemn, middle-aged. It was Donald Repo, the flight engineer who had died in the Everglades. Cabin crews whispered of Repo's ghost appearing in galley ovens, his reflection where no man stood, his voice whispering that safety checks must be doubled, that something was not as it seemed. More unsettling still were the warnings. One stewardess, shaken beyond words, swore that Repo's voice had told her of a fire long before one broke out mid-flight. When it did, the fire was contained before it could spread. How could she doubt then that the dead had intervened to save the living? Pilots too were not spared. Captain Loft, the man whose final command ended in mud and flame, began to appear in cockpits. He was seen sitting silently beside living pilots, his presence registering only when a co-pilot turned and found his face. Recognizable, impossibly familiar, utterly impossible. Some even claimed to speak with him, to hear his voice cautioning them about minor errors, to feel his hand lingering on controls before vanishing like smoke. The line between hallucination and haunting blurred, yet the consistency of the reports was too precise, too specific, too coherent to dismiss. Repo always in the mechanical heart of the plane, Loft always in the cockpit, each man returning to his duty, as though death had not dismissed him from his post. There was another detail, more disturbing still. The hauntings occurred not randomly but on specific aircraft, those fitted with salvaged parts from the wreckage of Flight 401. Ovens, instrument panels, mechanical systems transplanted from the swamp into other DC-10s became the stage for apparitions. It was as if those fragments of wreckage had absorbed trauma, become haunted relics carrying the fingerprints of the dead. In folklore, this is not surprising. Objects of tragedy often serve as vessels for spirit. In the Everglades, death and mud soaked into metal. Later, when that metal soared again, the spirits soared with it. This is where metaphor and machinery collide. A plane is a body, metal ribs, electrical nerves, engines like lungs, a cockpit like a brain. If parts of one body are transplanted into another, does the ghost of the donor linger? What surgeon could excise sorrow from steel? What engineer could drain memory from circuits? Passengers too began to tell stories, not always of visions but of atmospheres, of cold drafts moving through sealed cabins, of unease that settled like a weight on the chest. Some described conversations with uniformed men, who later proved not to exist. Others spoke of sudden certainty that they were not alone, even in the bright sterility of daylight flights. Children pointed at empty corners, naming men who should not have been there. Fear began to take root not only among those who believed in ghosts, but among those who did not. For disbelief offers no shield when enough witnesses speak the same truths. Skepticism is a house, but haunting is water. It seeps, erodes, undermines until even the strongest walls buckle. Eastern Airlines responded, as corporations always do, with denial. To admit the supernatural would be to admit liability, to risk panic, to invite ridicule. Officially, there were no ghosts. Officially, there was nothing unusual about flights serviced with salvaged parts. Yet behind closed doors, rumors persisted of maintenance crews refusing to work certain planes at night, of flight attendants requesting reassignment, of pilots who swore they would never again take a seat beside Captain Loft's silent ghost. One particular story is often told, repeated like scripture among believers. A flight boarding in Miami, where passengers were startled to see two uniformed crew members seated among them in first class. Polite, professional, reassuring, but when attendants checked, the manifest showed no such men. Witnesses later identified them, Loft and Repo, seated together, watching silently as though guarding the passengers for a journey no one else could yet understand. Are these stories true? Folklore rarely concerns itself with truth in the narrow sense. Folklore concerns itself with resonance, with what lingers, with what refuses to die. The ghosts of Flight 401 are remembered not because they are verifiable, but because they are persistent, because they fit into the eternal human suspicion that death does not sever duty, that tragedy does not dissolve presence, and the Everglades, dark and endless, remains the womb of these stories. To visit the crash site now is to find nothing, only water, reeds, silence. But silence is deceptive here. The swamp has already absorbed blood and metal, cries and smoke. It has woven them into its eternal murmur. And when a plane passes overhead, when its engines roar against the heavy air, perhaps the swamp releases its voices upward, reminding the sky that it has not forgotten. The haunting of the DC-10s is not, then, merely a collection of ghost sightings. It is a pattern, a mythology, a tale that binds technology to spirit, corporate efficiency to cosmic residue. It is the way modernity collides with the oldest of beliefs, that death is not an ending, but a displacement. That duty, love, fear, and grief cling to matter, whether flesh or steel, and so the stage was set for what would follow. Because every haunting has its escalation, its point where whispers become screams, where shadows step forward into the light. In the years after Flight 401, the apparitions grew bolder, the warnings more urgent, the encounters impossible to dismiss as mere imagination. What began as subtle unease would build into full supernatural confrontation. a crescendo of spirit refusing to be silenced. The swamp had claimed its men. The airline had stolen them back unknowingly through salvaged parts, and the men themselves, Loft Repo, were not done flying. They were not done commanding, not done protecting, not done haunting. Their story was only beginning. By the mid-1970s, the haunting of Eastern Airlines' DC-10 fleet was no longer a hidden rumor. It was an infection moving through the veins of aviation, a secret known too widely to be ignored, and yet too dangerous to be spoken aloud. The more the airline insisted there was nothing to fear, the more the stories multiplied. Silence became fuel, and whispers grew louder in the void of denial. It began as apparitions in peripheral vision, shadows seated where no passenger had boarded. But soon the hauntings gathered weight, boldness, resolve. It was as if the spirits of Captain Robert Loft and engineer Donald Repo had accepted their half-life aboard these machines, growing accustomed to their role in the cabins and cockpits of living flights. Their presence became almost ritualistic. On Flight 903, a stewardess entered the forward galley to prepare coffee. Steam curled from the oven, but within that cloud she saw a face, Repo's face. He was not twisted in agony, but grave, his eyes searching hers with the intensity of a warning unspoken. She dropped the pot, scalding water splattering across her shoes. When the other attendants rushed in, they saw nothing. She swore to them she had seen him so vividly that she smelled not only the coffee, but the faint tang of swamp water clinging to him. The oven was traced, of course. It had been salvaged from Flight 401. On another night, a full passenger cabin sat waiting for takeoff when several passengers grew unsettled. They insisted that 2 extra crew members were sitting silently in uniform among them, pale-faced, motionless. The flight attendants, irritated, asked the men for their boarding passes, but the men did not answer. They only stared. When the captain was called forward, he recognized them immediately. Loft and Repo, his former colleagues, his dead colleagues. Before the passengers' eyes, the two simply vanished, leaving the cabin shivering in an unnatural chill. The airline did everything it could to smother these accounts. Crews were threatened with dismissal if they mentioned ghosts in official logs. Passengers who complained were quietly compensated, their testimonies buried. But denial does not banish phantoms. In truth, the secrecy only made the stories more potent, for every forbidden word becomes more sacred when whispered in private. There are reports, always secondhand, always elusive, of pilots mid-flight glancing sideways and seeing Captain Loft seated at the controls beside them, his hands resting lightly on the throttles, his profile lit by the sterile green glow of instruments. Some swore he even spoke, his voice low, warning of minor errors, urging corrections. His presence was not malevolent. It was corrective, protective. But the sheer terror of sharing a cockpit with the dead was enough to unsettle even the most hardened professionals. One co-pilot, returning from a long-haul run, is said to have walked straight into the airline offices in Miami. Pale as chalk, and handed in his resignation. His explanation was simple: I won't fly with dead men. And always, at the center, was the swamp. For those who returned to the crash site years later, the Everglades carried an atmosphere impossible to mistake. It was as though the earth still remembered the impact, the shattering of aluminum, the cries of the dying. Hunters spoke of hearing engines roaring at night where no plane passed. Locals described strange lights hovering low over the reeds, like landing lights searching for a runway that no longer existed. Sometimes in the deepest fog, a silhouette of a DC-10 was said to emerge, ghostly, silent, dissolving into mist before the eyes of those who dared to look too long. The Everglades was not simply the grave. It was the cathedral, the theater, the archive of the haunting. The swamp was the conductor, and the apparitions aboard the planes were its echo. The climax of the haunting came when warnings began to be fulfilled. On one flight, Repo's ghost appeared not as a silent image but as a speaking presence. A flight attendant, exhausted, leaning against a bulkhead, felt a hand touch her shoulder. She turned, startled, and saw him. Repo. His eyes were focused, urgent. He told her plainly, "Check the starboard engine." She froze, unable to breathe, unable to move. When she finally summoned courage to call the engineer, they inspected the engine and discovered a fault that, had it gone unnoticed, might have ended the flight in catastrophe. This story spread like wildfire. For the first time, the haunting was not just omen but intervention, not simply memory but agency. The dead had acted to save the living. What does it mean when the line between ghost and guardian collapses? What does it mean when terror becomes protection, when dread becomes safety? For the crews of Eastern Airlines, it meant confusion, trembling devotion, and a terror that no rational denial could dispel. To be haunted is one thing, to be saved by the haunting is another, but protection did not erase fear. There is a weight in the human heart that resists sharing space with the dead, no matter how benevolent. The knowledge that a spectral hand might rest on your shoulder at any moment eroded the sanity of many. Some crews confessed to whispering prayers before entering cockpits, not against turbulence, but against the sudden appearance of Loft's hollow eyes beside them. The airline began, quietly, to remove salvaged parts. Ovens replaced, panels discarded, entire galleys dismantled and rebuilt, planes repainted, renumbered, reassigned. The ghosts seemed tied to their relics, as though the Everglades had embedded them into every salvaged screw and bolt. And when those relics were gone, the sightings diminished, but not entirely. Ghosts, once awakened, do not easily return to silence. There are still those who claim, even decades later, to have glimpsed Loft in the glow of a cockpit, or Repo in the dark reflection of a galley door. There are stories of strange knocks on locked cockpit doors, of shadows pacing the cabin at 3 a.m., of whispered voices heard over radio static when no other aircraft was near. The haunting had crested, reached its climax, and slowly ebbed with the dismantling of the fleet. Yet it never disappeared. The climax was not a conclusion. It was a revelation that the sky itself is haunted, that the Everglades is a wound still bleeding memory into metal. That flight is not merely physics but faith, and faith attracts the unseen. For those who believe, the climax of the DC-10 ghost is not simply a chapter of aviation folklore. It is proof that death is porous, that duty survives the grave, that men like Loft and Repo can never truly land. They remain at cruising altitude, forever circling, forever watching. And as with all hauntings, once the climax is reached, what follows is not resolution, but aftermath, an ending that refuses to end. The Everglades is not a place that forgives. It is not a place that forgets. Time passes differently here, measured not in days or decades, but in the shifting whispers of reeds, in the restless breath of the swamp, in the unseen eyes that stare out from the dark water. Long after the wreckage of Flight 401 had been cleared away, after newspapers had faded, and headlines had become nothing more than brittle clippings in archival drawers, the swamp remembered. The swamp always remembers. The story could have ended with the crash, with the flames dying, with the rescue teams pulling their bodies from the mud. It could have ended when the wreckage was melted down, its parts scattered across other aircraft that took to the skies under new designations, new flight numbers, as if the ghosts could be melted, reforged, renamed. But nothing supernatural follows the logic of industry. Ghosts are not soothed by paperwork or mechanical explanations. Ghosts are the remainder that resists. And so the story of Flight 401 was never buried. It persisted, mutating, flowing from the Everglades outward like a ripple of contamination, finding its way into new planes, into new airports, into the dreams of passengers and the memories of crew. A legend, yes, but more than a legend. Legends can be ignored. Legends can be laughed off, but this was something that clawed at the edges of reality. This was something that never left. The first whispers were brushed off as stress. Passengers reported strange reflections in their windows, men in uniform staring back at them from the glass, faces pale, eyes wide, expressions fixed in something between warning and despair. The crew dismissed them. Cabin lights can distort, a trick of shadow, fatigue. Yet when multiple passengers seated in different rows described the same man, square-jawed, dark-haired, with the insignia of Eastern Airlines, it began to sound less like fatigue and more like something systemic. Mechanics reported shadows that did not belong to their own movements. Shadows of men climbing ladders, of figures crouched beneath landing gears. These shapes dissolved when approached, leaving behind the smell of burned fabric and something else, the faint copper tang of blood that had no source. The swamp itself seemed to send its emissaries. The wreckage had been cleared, but the crash site was never fully clean. Every year, hunters and explorers claimed they found twisted shards of metal deep in the water, curved fragments that gleamed strangely even in moonlight. And near these fragments, they heard the cries, thin metallic cries like voices filtered through radio static. "We can't see the runway. Go around. Help us." And then silence. Always silence. The scariest part of the Flight 401 story is not the swamp, nor the crash itself, but the persistence of the dead in the physical world, Parts of the DC-10 were salvaged, repurposed, installed into other aircraft within Eastern's fleet. After all, metal is metal. Why let it rot in the mud when it can carry passengers once more? But this decision seeded a haunting unlike any other. On one plane, a galley oven that had been transplanted from Flight 401 began to rattle by itself. Flight attendants swore they saw a man leaning against it, arms folded, watching them. His presence wasn't hostile, but he never spoke. He simply stood, a reminder, a sentinel. When they later compared notes, they realized they had all described the same man. Second Officer Don Repo, who had died in the crash. In another plane, a captain preparing for departure found a man already seated in the cockpit. Startled, he demanded to know who he was and why he was there. The man turned his head slowly and said, "You don't need to worry about this flight. We've already taken care of it." Then he vanished. The captain, shaken, later identified the man as Captain Bob Loft, Flight 401's pilot. Imagine the terror of that. Not just hearing a ghost, not just glimpsing a flicker of shadow, but confronting an apparition so solid, so immediate, that it could be mistaken for flesh and blood until the very moment it dissolved. The airline attempted to hush it all up, of course. They burned maintenance logs, threatened staff, laughed publicly at the rumors. But you cannot erase testimony when it comes from dozens of mouths, across different times, on different aircraft. The consistency of detail was too sharp to be mere invention. The DC-10 ghosts did not merely haunt. They embedded themselves in the machinery, welded into every rivet, every panel, every transplanted part. They became guardians or reminders, or perhaps curses. There are stories still whispered of phantom passengers. A woman boarding a late-night Eastern flight once complained about the man seated beside her. He was pale, cold to the touch, and would not respond when she asked him questions. She pressed the flight attendant for help. The attendant leaned in, touched the man's shoulder, and he vanished into the air, leaving the seatbelt still fastened around nothing at all. Crew members on red-eye flights reported hearing sobbing in the lavatories, but when the doors were unlocked, the compartments were empty. Some described the smell of swamp water flooding the cabin for a few seconds, before dispersing as if it had never been. Others swore that for brief moments the temperature in the galley would plummet, their breath visible as though they were standing not inside a pressurized plane, but out in the middle of the Everglades on that December night. And sometimes, when the cockpit was quiet and the hum of the engines became steady, pilots heard voices whispering through the comm system. The words were often fragmented, but always the same in tone: regret, warning, loss. One phrase returned again and again, carried like a message across the decades: "We're still here." It is tempting to believe the haunting lived only in steel, only in the recycled parts of Flight 401. But the swamp itself remained saturated with presence. Travelers lost in the Everglades sometimes reported lights flickering in the distance, as if an invisible plane were circling above them. These lights would dip low, skim across the water, and vanish into the reeds. Rescue helicopters occasionally picked up false radar echoes in the same region, registering the blip of an approaching aircraft that never appeared. Some swore they could even hear faint distress calls over the radio, repeating endlessly, "We can't see the runway. Go around, go around." But the most chilling testimonies came from those few who stumbled too close to the site. They spoke of half-submerged figures clawing at the muck, their uniforms shredded, their eyes wide with animal panic. Yet when approached, the figures dissolved into mist, leaving only the ripple of disturbed water. The swamp did not want to give them up. It held them, preserved them not in flesh but in memory, in energy, in imprint. It became a reliquary of unresolved death, a cathedral where the congregation was made of echoes. And so we return to the central paradox of the DC-10 ghosts. They are at once tragedy and warning, guardians and prisoners. They appear not to harm but to remind. Their presence is not malevolent, yet it is deeply unsettling because it insists on continuity, on refusal. They did not dissolve when the wreckage was cleared, when the planes were retired, when the airline itself collapsed into history. They linger. They insist. Perhaps that is the most frightening thing. Not the crash itself, not the swamp, not the apparitions in the galley ovens, but the idea that death does not conclude, that there are some stories too heavy to be buried, that the sky itself can become haunted, that every time we step onto a plane, we are not stepping into a neutral space of technology and travel, but into a vessel of memory, where every rivet might whisper, every shadow might conceal, every reflection might belong to someone who never made it home. The DC-10 ghosts remind us that flight is never without risk, that the illusion of control is fragile. They remind us that the past has claws, and perhaps when the engines roar and the wheels leave the ground, it is not only the living who rise into the sky. Perhaps the dead fly with us, unseen passengers, carried endlessly from departure to arrival, never truly landing, never truly gone. So if you ever feel a sudden chill in the cabin, or see a man in uniform watching you with sorrowful eyes, or hear a whisper through the static of the intercom, remember, it might be nothing, or it might be the swamp still speaking, and the swamp does not lie.